During my first semester of physical therapy school, I made a lot of study mistakes that really put me behind coming into midterms and made me really struggle on those first exams because I was studying the same way I did when I was in college. In today's video, I'm going to tell you guys a couple key ways to change your study habits going into physical therapy school so you don't make the same mistakes I did. The first thing to look at is your breaks during your study sessions. So while you're timing out how long you want to study for, you want to make sure that when you take breaks, you take a low dopamine break. What I mean by this is you want to make sure that when you, let's say you study for like 30 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break, you don't go immediately on your phone and watch YouTube videos or go on social media or go do something fun and exciting. Because what happens is it's really hard to pull you back into that flow state of working because you're giving yourself a big dopamine hit, and it makes it like seem really boring to go back to studying, and you almost don't want to go back. And I found a lot of times that my 5-minute breaks would turn into 10, 15, or even an hour break before I get back to studying because I'd basically want to do anything else but study. So that was the first thing I learned. So instead of going onto your phone or running around and doing something exciting, I would either try to literally just go and stare at the wall, and I would do this by I would just get a foam roller and just kind of foam roll into extension because I've been sitting kind of in a flex position studying. So really just foam roll and look up at the wall, or I would just pace around a little bit. I would do like a menial task like pick up the clothes on the floor or do a little like cleanup or a chore I didn't want to do, and that was almost worse than studying. Then after like 5-10 minutes, when you get a bit of a brain break, you're actually like, all right, I'm actually would rather go back to studying than doing what I'm currently doing. And so that helped me a lot with taking short breaks when I got tired and then getting back into the flow state for studying. The next thing you want to look at is getting into a deep flow work state where you can get a lot done in a small amount of time. I mentioned this in a few of my other videos about time management and study habits. They want to chunk out some amount of time every day for studying, but you want to make that good quality studying. And so you want to try to minimize distractions because every time you get distracted, it takes anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes for you to get focused back on the task and get back to a good workflow. And so you really disrupt the amount of time you can get into a deep work state and get a lot of things down. So I would recommend trying to do anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, and this is something that you have to kind of work on over time, is like training that brain muscle to really try to sit there and focus for longer periods of time. And if you keep breaking that focus, especially with high dopamine breaks, it's really difficult to actually sit in a zone for a couple hours and get a lot of work done. So that leads me to my next habit, which is finding a study group, but a small study group. So you don't want to get in a big group of friends of like 5 or 10 people where you end up doing a lot of talking, people are all over the place, and you end up having a lot of different study habits and different like speeds at which you're learning the material. And the problem with this is you may have someone that's either really fast and got the material and wants to move on to the next thing before you're ready, and maybe there's 1 or 2 people that go with them and they don't really take the time to teach you because they kind of just internally got it. Or you have people that maybe are a lot slower than you at the material, again, which is fine, but maybe you spend a lot of time repeating things that you already have down and that maybe you don't want to go over, and you feel like you have more pressing things to get to. So try to find a group of anywhere from 2 to 3 people that study at a similar pace than you, and they also study in a way that actually promotes learning for each other, because everyone learns in different ways. Some people like to sit there and write out everything on a whiteboard or make certain algorithms or flowcharts. Other people would rather watch like a YouTube video on the topic because they're like a visual learner that way. For me, I like doing a lot of like quizzing, like just bouncing ideas back and forth works really well for me. So we'd go through the slides and generate questions, and everyone would take a few slides and quiz each other, and that works good for me and my study group. So find what works between your groups and keep those groups small so you don't get distracted and waste a lot of time just talking, because that'll happen easily. Even if you're all generally focused people, once your group gets more than like 4 or 5 people, you're going to go all over the place. So keep the group small. The next thing you want to look at is making sure that you have good quality sleep. This is extremely important. I make sure that I usually try to taper down my technology use and my studying at least an hour before bed, and ideally have the lights dimmed. You want to get a good night of sleep because that's going to start reinforcing all those things you learned during the day. All right, that's really crucial. You don't want to be cramming right before midterms or finals and doing multiple nights of like sub 6 hours of sleep. That's really going to make it hard to do that long-term recall. Speaking of long-term recall, and that's the next study habit I want to talk about. Try not to do basically short-term recall only, where you just look at slides and then you might quiz yourself, or you basically only go back to looking at slides constantly. you want to switch up the way you're studying the material. So usually what I'll do is after we've had a lecture that day, it's nice to hop over that lecture again while it's fresh in your mind, but don't just read through the slides again. Try to go to the objectives if the professor gave you objectives, or just go to the headers of each slide and see if you can quiz yourself on kind of the big topics for the week. Because a lot of times if you're in lectures from, let's say, 8 a.m. to around 4 p.m., you won't really have enough time in the day to actually deeply go over all the material, especially if you already have like quizzes and other things building up for the next days that you got to keep up on. It's pretty normal to not be able to cover all the material in a day, and that's one of the mistakes I made when I first came into PT school, because in college I would just go over the slides basically the same day every time, and that's because I had a lot less material per day that I did in college. In PT school you can't do that. It would take you the entire night to do that. You just don't have the time for that, especially if you're prepping for different things and you still have to work out, dinner, shower, you need breaks. Yeah, you've been in school all day. I would recommend quickly going over it anywhere from 15 to up to 30 minutes per class that you did that day. So let's say you had 3 classes that day, you're doing an hour and a half of review from those lectures, and that's just reviewing and quizzing yourself, trying to test your recall for that day. Don't just read over the slides again. And then what you can do is, since you haven't dug into it deeply during the week, you save that until you get to the weekend. When you get to the weekend, or just on a day maybe when you have several hours of study time, then go in and dig in on that material, really break it down. You can try to quiz yourself first, but then you can go over some of the slides because you probably don't remember everything that the professor went over, or go over recordings you took or videos you took. Pull up extra YouTube videos, help explain things you have questions on, take a lot of notes, do all that work when you have more time later in the week. So don't try to cram it all in on one day. And so that's how it's going to look like, because a lot of times, like I mentioned before, you have other things you need to do. So you can spend anywhere from an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours on that day's material, but you probably also need to spend some time on previous material to get ready for later in the week for labs. You're going to have assignments to do, other things. So you want to make sure that you keep that study time pared down as needed. And on the weekends, you dig in more and then start quizzing with your friends in your quiz group. So usually what is most efficient is when you first get introduced to new material, focus on quizzing yourself first, test your long-term recall, dig into it more on yourself, then do a second time of long-term recall quizzing by yourself, and then try to introduce it to a small group setting where you guys can work out details of like, hey, this thing still confused me, I'm not 100% sure on it, let's talk it out. Sometimes you get a different perspective from your classmates, and that way you've already had a few reps through the material, so you're not kind of struggling to learn the material for the first time with your classmates, because what happens is you end up not really testing that long-term recall. You're just having either a classmate tell it to you or you're reading from the slides, and that's a lot less efficient for memorizing it long-term, because that's the key. Yes, you can regurgitate all the information on an exam if you try to cram a few days before, but what happens is there's a circulating curriculum in the schools, so if you don't actually get that into long-term learning, you're going to struggle in the later classes and you're going to struggle in your clinicals as well. If some of these tips helped you, comment down below and let me know, and subscribe so you can see the next video on some more ways to get through PT school. Thank you.